Well, thanks again for coming. I'm Kevin Costa. I'm the Associate Director for Content and Communications at Absci. And I'm just really thrilled to be up here with this amazing panel to talk about how we're going to make the pharmaceutical supply chain sustainable going forward and making medicines accessible. It was a coincidence when we had our our panel call earlier. It was the same day that the New York Times ran a story about the drug shortage crisis that is affecting, diseases like cancer. There are now cancer patients who are being rationed medicine for their disease at this very moment. So this is not an academic topic whatsoever. And so I'm glad that the companies here are thinking about that topic and helping to solve the problem. I'm going to get out of the way as much as possible and let these folks do most of the talking. Maybe I can ask each of you to just introduce yourself, say a word or two about why you're here and why this topic is important to you. Do you want to start, John?
Sure. John Nicols. I'm the former CEO of Codexis. I led Codexis for about 10 years until last fall. Prior to that, I had 20 years in the chemical industry, 20 plus years, 6 of which I led a CMO, a custom manufacturing operation within my company serving pharmaceuticals. So I got experience both on the chemical side at Albemarle and now the biochemical side at Codexis. Since stepping down as CEO, I'm going to stay active in the space. I love synthetic biology. I think it's going to have great impact in the long run. It's easier said than done. And I put myself out there at this event and a little bit prior to do some advisory work, get involved in boards. And my friend all the way on the left quickly scooped me up because we definitely share a passion in this subject. So I've joined the board of Antheia, joining Christina very, very recently.
Well, we're lucky. The SynBio community is lucky to still have you with us.
Pleasure.
Thanks for sticking around. We didn't scare you off. Cameron, you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey everyone, I'm Cameron Fox. I'm now at a small strategy and innovation consultancy in New York called Luminary Labs. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'll mostly be talking from my last role, where I led a lot of the World Economic Forum's work on synthetic biology and the bioeconomy, trying to understand what this means on an international context and how we figure out what we're focusing on and aligning a lot of different stakeholders across the private sector, public sector, academia, civil society. So really excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for your work there. And Christina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Smolke. I'm one of the co-founders and also the CEO of Antheia. Prior to my position at Antheia, I was a professor of chemical engineering and bioengineering at Stanford University and also at Caltech. So I got into this, my background in chemical engineering, I was always very interested on how we make products at scale. I became very inspired early on in my career with biochemistry and how biology actually takes different approaches to make molecules and materials, and worked, in my academic lab on how we could begin to program and build biology sort of from the bottom up and use it as a synthesis technology. And in particular, focused a lot of our early work on being able to synthesize compounds and molecules that would be difficult to produce with our existing technologies, chemical synthesis. And that really led us to the work that Antheia is founded on. And so Antheia is leveraging synthetic biology to be able to produce active ingredients, pharmaceutical ingredients, in more efficient and cost-effective ways. And that pertains, I think, very directly to the topic of today's session.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talked about it at your talk a couple of days ago about what Antheia is doing, but can you do a little bit more? Can I double-click to have you set the scene a little bit there about what are the challenges that we're talking about when it comes to these active, these APIs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think setting the background and having a sense of the value that synthetic biology can bring to this industry and to this problem, it's good to understand where we're currently at, why our supply chains are increasingly fragile, and why we are having trouble synthesizing many of our drugs reliably. So there's essentially, if we look at conventional synthesis technologies, there's two approaches that are used in industry today. The first one is harvesting from nature. And that, many people don't realize this, but there's a very substantial fraction of our drugs for which we still use that approach today. And it's approximately 40% of our drugs, right? And so what this looks like is, we are growing or cultivating biological organisms. Many times they're medicinal plants, but they can be animals and they can be other organisms. And they naturally will produce these bioactive ingredients that humans have uncovered over time can be useful as medicines. So we grow that biomass and then we basically extract relatively small quantities of those bioactive compounds that the natural organism will produce. And then that extracted molecule will go through further processing until it ultimately will be formulated into a product.
You say that so nicely. At least for some of them, we have farms of pigs, we slaughter them, we take compounds out of their liver,
Yes.
we purify it, and we inject it into humans.
Yes.
That
Exactly.
it's not pretty.
It's not pretty, and there's a lot of waste. It's not pretty, and there's a lot of waste because we are ultimately, all the rest of that biomass ultimately, in many cases, does not get used. Beyond the sort of waste of it, it leads to supply chains that, number one, have very long time frames, right? Just to grow that biomass. So oftentimes manufacturing cycles can be on the order of several years, right? Just because of the time it takes to grow that biomass. And then as we're seeing, it's becoming increasingly vulnerable to outside factors, whether it's changes in climate that can affect the yield from growing season to growing season, pests and disease, right, that can impact, again, your ability to grow that biomass, and other factors, geopolitical events, sociopolitical events. And so these supply chains are becoming increasingly fragile and breaking down. Now, the other way that we produce the other molecules, right, or the other set of medicines are being produced through chemical processing. I think this is how I think most of us envision how our products get made. They get made in a factory, starting with different types of raw ingredients, and they're being built up via synthesis techniques that are coming through chemical synthesis, essentially. This is a technology that's been in use for many decades, and it can be very efficient. So it has introduced efficiencies into many of our manufacturing processes. To give you an example, aspirin is a medicine that we used to extract from trees, right? Then, when chemical synthesis technology came to being, we switched from producing aspirin and extracting it from a tree to producing it via chemical synthesis. And so it introduced a lot of efficiencies to that. The limitation is that many of our medicines can't be made through chemical synthesis. Their structures are too complex, such that the tools of chemical synthesis just can't produce them efficiently. And that's why we still today will rely on extracting from nature, because nature is one of the things that nature does very well, in contrast to sort of how we build with chemical synthesis, is it can build out very complex molecules very efficiently, because we use enzymes as catalyst as opposed to the standard catalyst that chemical synthesis technology uses. And so, again, that takes us to where we are today, essentially, where we have these two technologies, right? And the other challenges that are faced within our supply chains is that they are very geographically concentrated. Generally, when you look at our our pharmaceutical supply chains, most of our active pharmaceutical ingredients are coming from 1 to 2 countries, basically China and India. And even a lot of the sort of starting materials that India is using ultimately traces back to China. This geographical reliance also introduces a lot of fragility into our supply chains, because when we have spikes in, basically there's not a lot of redundancy and there's not resiliency, right? So we saw this during COVID. There was demand increase for certain types of medicines. There's no capacity in other countries to sort of pick up production, and that's not something with our existing technologies that you can just turn on. But I also just want to highlight that it's not limited to a COVID issue. So it's not, okay, COVID's over, we don't have drug shortages anymore. Clearly we do, as we're seeing with the New York Times article. We were having them before COVID, and then we've seen that they are increasing. They continue to increase, even with COVID, sort of going down and that demand going away.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a lot there. John, I was going to ask you to put on your big pharma hat. But when you hear that, how is pharma receiving this? They must be aware of this, and does that sort of ring true? How are they taking the news, and do they see synthetic biology as a potential solution?
Two questions there. The first one is they take it very seriously. They make a lot of money off these drugs.
Yeah.
And they get a lot of black eyes. And the pharmaceutical industry is not the darling industry in the public image, right? So these things just diminish their reputation, and so they take this stuff seriously. Now how they deal with it is another question. As far as how the pharmaceutical industry receives and views synthetic biology, I'd say two answers. One is they're the granddaddies of synthetic biology, the whole large molecule drug industry, which is a massive, I don't know how many, maybe even $1 trillion industry. It's effectively synthetic biology. They are the granddaddy of building, large molecule manufacturing, process developments that we're all exploiting here. As they think about small molecule drugs, I don't think they have much recognition of how potentially valuable synthetic biology can be. So I think focusing it on small molecule drugs highlights just the awareness gap and the opportunity for us. Because increasingly, companies like Antheia, maybe companies in the room, companies like Codexis, which I used to run, are showing that synthetic biology can be a great tool to not only produce more sustainably, but also at significantly lower economic cost, lower capital, et cetera. So, but it goes back to where were the scientists trained in big pharma, and it's unlike the youthfulness of the synthetic biology industry. You've got an aging generation in the pharmaceutical industry, and they were educated decades ago, and I didn't have biochemical engineering when I graduated as a chemical engineer, wasn't even there. So, and that's not unlike a lot of the chemists that are in big pharma. Finally, there's definitely a stratification of pharmaceutical companies as to how they look at synthetic biology. I think the generic industry is woefully underutilizing synthetic biology. So that's stratification number one. In the larger pharmaceutical companies, for small molecules, there are some companies that are just unbelievably utilizing synthetic biology, and they're few and a minority, and then there are others that are just ignoring it. And they're building the molecules the way they always build the molecules, as efficiently or unsustainably as they were.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's my new favorite quote from this meeting, that pharma is the granddaddy of sin.
It's true, let's face it.
You mentioned also generics, and I think that's one of the areas where actually a lot of these supply chain problems are coming up, and where other parts of the world may benefit from this. And so I wanted to hand it over to Cameron and ask if you think that there's an opportunity for these synthetic biology technologies and to develop the raw materials and enable access to medicines, maybe not here in California, but elsewhere.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an opportunity, and like you pointed out, it's the granddaddy. They've been doing this for a long time, and it's something that I feel like is left out of this conversation a lot. I mean, you think about insulin, that's really one of the first examples that we have that is truly synthetic biology. And so while I think that opportunity is there, the concern around generics is very real. Those margins are so slim that until the cost comes down, it's hard to see it changing rapidly. And the other concern I have, using insulin as an example, when it was discovered in the 1920s, there was this idea that everyone should have access. Insulin costs a lot in this country. We make it in a way that should be quite easy and scalable, and we don't have that. And something that I heard Kimmy say on a panel yesterday, my former colleague at WEF, was that we should always keep in mind that technical innovation is necessary, but not sufficient for societal change, for the way that we are dispersing resources in the broadest sense. But I don't want to be too much of a wet blanket. I do think there's an enormous opportunity here, and in the next few years, as we continue to have marvelous breakthroughs in so many different ways, maybe that cost is competitive for generics, and I have to hope so.
Yeah. Well, let's double click on those non-technical factors real quick. What are, beyond the technical, what are some of the other considerations that you think about at WEF or otherwise when bringing these drugs to other markets?
I would say the biggest one is just the industry that you're operating in, which is healthcare, which is obviously regulated like nothing else. It's such a patchwork of regulations in different places, and there were fewer headaches. One of the biggest headaches that I always had at the forum was looking at different healthcare systems and trying to even get a grasp on how do we all point in the same direction? Like, what kind of alignment is there between very, very different systems in the US, in the EU? You know, we still have a lot of different regulations around, say, GMOs, for example. And it's just such a highly regulated space, as it should be, given what the end goal is. But that is by far the biggest challenge that I see.
Harmonization of the regulatory landscape. Christina, a little while ago, you mentioned COVID and the fact that supply chain problems are obviously not over. I wonder if you could kind of just unpack that a little bit more. Like what could we do to sort of prevent the next kind of COVID related supply chain problems from occurring? Is there if you could go back in time, like how would you have prevented those supply chain problems from happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so I think what, and as now, people are starting to look at what, the problem and the scope of the problem, I think a number of things are coming to light. And it's, first of all, it starts with the data that we have and the transparency that we have into these supply chains, which is very, very limited, right? And again, part of this is because, for example, I mean, we don't do the manufacturing in this country, and a lot of it's not occurring in Europe, it's occurring, in India and China, and so there's just not a lot of transparency into the full supply chain, right? And so it's hard to anticipate, okay, what does it actually look like, sort of layered down into the supply chain? Does it look like there are shortages coming up? Was the yield, from this crop, right, or from this batch much lower? And should we anticipate that? What is going to happen if demand sort of skyrockets, right? Are we going to be in an issue? And so, are we going to face problems? And so I think, one, it would be to try to build a system that has much more transparency and data that is being shared, right? And especially if you're going to have a global system, right, where it's shared sort of globally, so that one can anticipate where the vulnerabilities are, and be able, and then be able to react to it. So that's the first thing, is just the data is not there, the transparency is not there. And so we're caught oftentimes unaware when we should not be, right? It's just because we do not have that transparency. The second thing I think then is with that, would be to try to build systems that have resiliency built into them, that aren't necessarily dependent on, one or two geographical locations, but where you have a more, and I mean, distributed isn't the right word, but where you have basically different sites for manufacturing, number one, and you have that sort of capacity to be able to respond. But I think along with that, and this comes into maybe, coming back to sort of the innovation that synthetic biology can bring as a manufacturing approach, if we can rely on manufacturing technologies and have a supply chain sort of set up that is more agile and more rapid response, then we with that transparency, we have the ability to be more nimble in our manufacturing structure, right? So again, if we have current supply chains where a manufacturing cycle can take 2 or more years, there's not much we can do if we start to experience a shortage, right? We're not going to be able to push more through the system with that type of lag time. If instead we have a manufacturing technology where you have a common infrastructure, a fermenter, you have, hundreds to thousands of strains of yeast or whatever microorganism you want to select kind of on the shelf that can produce whatever, drugs or whatever kind of critical drugs you've sort of highlighted. And you can put them in, and the manufacturing cycle is 2 weeks, right, to produce, tons or whatever quantity you would want. That changes the landscape dramatically, right? And so if we can begin to reshape our supply chains to have this agility and have this sort of rapid response, plug and play kind of structure, I think that would do a lot, paired with the data, right? And just having that type of transparency and sharing that more broadly.
Do you get the sense that manufacturers even have the data to share?
I don't. Because again, it's so fragmented and segmented, right? No, I don't think the data is there. I mean, I think if, just at my own, looking at sort of the government reports that have come out on this, I mean, they flagged this. U.S. has had a number of reports, right, over the past several years on this. They have flagged that as, a critical issue, right, and a critical thing that needs to be solved. And again, I think because it is so segmented across different countries and there isn't a lot of transparency into some of these countries, right, in terms of that data, it's not there, but it is recognized to be a problem, right? And so again, I think it's building a network, right, of players that we can begin to, and really putting that as like a priority. But I think that's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, maybe just following on. So wanted to get you to amplify for us, Christina, that I think I heard you say that a fermentation approach may create more asset agility to produce drugs. But just to highlight how inflexible assets are for today's chemical rounds to make new drugs. They are dedicated facilities, massive asset bases. Anybody visited a chemical API manufacturing facility? They're huge. And they are not flexible. They can't go from making, atorvastatin this day to simvastatin that day. They're not. So the reality is, and there's so much pressure on cost of drugs that it drives this industry to be as low cost as possible. Absolutely, fully utilizing the assets every day, every second is the goal. You fully utilize the asset. You can have lower cost. And you can satisfy the market's demand for low-priced drugs. And they barely make a margin, right? It's not like they're swimming in profits in the generic industry. That can't move on a dime. If there's a hiccup in that plant or there's some disruption, boom, that factory is 20% of the world's manufacturer of that drug problem instantly. So tell us how fermentation could actually be a more agile approach. How it can be more flexible to make drugs and be more efficient with the assets.
Yeah, so I mean, again, it comes back to when you look at a fermentation, the actual equipment that is used to basically grow the yeast or whatever, different microorganisms. I mean, it's basically the infrastructure is the same, regardless of whether you're making, paclitaxel or whether you're making, ampicillin. I mean, whatever drug. It's really what's directing it is going to be the growth of that microorganism, right? And so this is how fermentation and biomanufacturing can be a more agile platform, is you can take that fermenter or the sets of fermenter trains that you have set up, and again, that infrastructure doesn't change. You're just changing the yeast or bacteria that you put into that fermenter. You can swap them in and out, right? Doing a changeover from a yeast that makes molecule A to a yeast that makes molecule B, basically you can do those changeovers in a day or two. It's basically standard procedures for cleaning out the fermenter, but you don't have to change the infrastructure, and so that gives you the agility to really be swapping that conserved infrastructure across different drugs. Now you will have the purification trains, right? But so essentially after you've gone through the fermentation, your molecule is now in that fermentation broth, and you have to go through a set of unit operations, right? A set of processes that are going to purify it to its really pure form as an API. But again, there's going to be a standard set of unit operations that can be set up within that facility to allow you to do that purification. So again, and you're absolutely right. I mean, in contrast to the chemical industry where you do have these dedicated facilities that are really heavy on infrastructure, you cannot turn them. Biomanufacturing is just a completely different model.
Yeah. And John, you had anticipated my question. Like, how easy is it going to be for pharma to adopt these new technologies, a new fermentation, for example, sort of framework.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't sound very easy.
No, it's not easy. Probably Christina can speak to it even more. We've got to design a fermentation process that is at least competitive economically. Maybe there'll be some drivers governmentally to enable a higher cost to create these flexibility benefits. Probably not, but maybe. So we've got to be competitive with the strains and the overall unit economic costs. And then we've got to scale it, right? We've got to put, and so a lot of fermentation capacity is required to make the volume of these particular generic, widely used drugs. And that scale is not in place today, either in the companies in this room as much as we need or, to support us as custom manufacturers. So these are big challenges from a supply chain perspective.
I wonder if we can step back and just talk about what are the drugs that we're actually talking about? What are the drugs that are in shortage? I mentioned generics and also really high-end kind of cancer therapies. I don't know if Christina or Cameron, you want to take a shot at that?
That's you.
Oh.
I'm not sure either.
No, you can. So it's a diversity of drugs, really, right? But and maybe coming back to also some of the things we can do. But generally, the drugs that we're looking at tend to be drugs that are widely used. They are generics, right? The ones that we're experiencing severe shortages in. And they're being tracked, right? So in the U.S., you can go to the FDA website. They will basically have a list of drug shortages. It'll also tell you ones that were previously in shortage, right, and are no longer in shortage. But it's a pretty extensive list, right? And it's also, I will just say, it's a problem that's getting worse. So there have been reports that have been starting to collect data on this coming out from the government. The frequency of drug shortages is increasing. Right, so from 2021 to 2022, drug shortages increased by 30%, right? The average duration of drug shortages is also increasing. So average now is about 1.5 years, but there are a number of drugs that have been in shortage for over a decade, right? What are these drugs? Well, for example, this past winter, many of us probably went to the grocery store and could not find any children's Tylenol, right? Basically, a lot of the cold medicines and also antibiotics were in shortage, right? Why was this? It was because there were a number of different respiratory viruses that were going through the country, right? And just again, demand skyrocketed, and we experienced shortages in antibiotics. Medicine like Adderall is also in shortage, right? The New York Times, right? There are a number of chemotherapeutic drugs to treat different cancers that are in shortage. It's really a broad diversity, so it's not just one area. There's also pain medicines that are in shortage. There are medicines that are used to treat cardiac arrest, right? Used for patients that are intubated. Those are in shortage as well. So it's not just one area. It's really very broad, and again, it's a problem that's increasing.
So basically, no part of the pharma, market is untouched.
It isn't. No part is untouched, and some of it is this sort of demand, right, where you see just unanticipated demand sort of come all at once for certain types of medicines, and that leads to these shortages. And others is just some of these medicines, especially with some of the chemotherapeutics, right. They're either fairly niche or just, again, the manufacturing is very complicated, relies on a small number of suppliers, and if one of them goes down, right, it just wipes out the supply.
Yeah. So as we think about, perhaps a more distributed source of APIs and how we would create that, Cameron, I'm curious your thoughts. Again, taking a little bit more of a global view. What are the things we should be thinking about as we develop that infrastructure so that we don't kind of repeat the past mistakes of either focusing, in certain geographic areas and so forth? But what are the sort of things you would think about in building the ideal sort of supply chain?
Yeah, you mentioned distributed innovation. Where are these physically being produced? Pretty Druidy quote. atoms are local. Like, if we're going to shrink supply chains, my concern is that the part that disappears is the huge chunk of the world that isn't San Francisco, Boston, Cambridge, what have you. And if we get to a place where we are able to manufacture everything locally, we need to be really, really careful that we're not just doing it in the places we always talk about, especially since so many of these molecules, as Christina mentioned, ultimately come from nature, and a lot of them have been extracted from places like the Amazon or West Africa. And if we're going to say, hooray, now we can make them here, don't need you anymore, that's going to be a really scary world. And, while it would be better to not have supply chains so long and so, vague on where things are coming from, where shortages are going to be, we have to really think about what it means to build capacity in the entire world. This was something that I worked on a lot at the World Economic Forum. Did a big project called Changing Geographies of Innovation, where we were working with folks in a lot of these places to understand, what does that look like for you? What are you missing? Is it funding? Is it regulatory? And how do we change towards a world where you have access to these no matter where you are, and the ultimate source isn't that far away from you?
John, I think when we had our call, you said that, in some sense, pharma doesn't care about cost especially in the discovery phase of things, and that might present an opportunity for us to, I think you said, get to know the pipeline of these companies so that SynBio can come in and provide a competitive model. Can you kind of expand on that?
Yeah. I think it's a great opportunity. I think, when we talk about supply shortages, it is focused on the generic industry. I think Christina educated all of us on that problem and how it's growing. How much do you think Big Pharma is involved in generics? Really close to zero. Big Pharma is involved in developing and selling patented drugs. And when it goes generic, they almost always, not always, but almost always just give it up and let it move into China and India to be supplied at lower costs and lower margins by other companies. So Big Pharma is not really associated with the vast majority of these supply problems, and Big Pharma builds redundancies into their supply chains for their 95% margin products. The worst thing that can happen in a pharmaceutical company is they spend, the $10 billion to get approval for a drug, and it's selling, billions of dollars a year at 95% margin, and there's a shortage, heads are rolling in the supply chain department. They will make sure they have redundancy that never happens. And therefore, it usually, I don't know any examples where it has. So,
That's really interesting.
So the patented drug world is very different from the description that we just talked about. There are a lot of opportunities for synthetic biology in the patented drug world. It's a whole different game because you generally, Codexis pioneered this. Jim's in the room. He pioneered it before he ever joined the company. You generally get involved with them as they're going through the development process for their drugs. You help them to see a better biosynthetic pathway for the complex molecule that they have in preclinical or clinical development versus whatever their chemists have come up with. And we're smart enough to do that. If they'll give you access and they trust you, they give you access to the kind of molecules that are in their pipeline, our chemists in the synthetic biology universe will be able to show them that there's a better way with fermentation or cell-free enzymatic approaches. And they're not as knowledgeable as they should be to see that themselves, but when they see it and they're educated by our great community, they will embrace it, and they will get it locked in before it gets too late in clinical development, and before it gets approved by the FDA. And that's a great opportunity, and I'll amplify that for you all, because that's, if you start in phase 1, that drug may not ever make it, probably won't make it, and it will take a long time for it to make it to approval and start to buy your synthetic biology product. That's the bad news. The good news is the patented drug companies are swimming in cash, spend mountains of money in development, and they'll fund it. You can negotiate to get funded so that you're not making the investment, they're making the investment for you to build your biosynthetic pathway with them. So that's the deal. It takes a long time. It took, decades for Codexis to build a portfolio of products that are commercially installed in commercial drug manufacturing processes, but we're there. And it's growing because we're working in the preclinical and the early clinical stages to get biosynthetic pathways installed. So we can all do that. And you can get help from the pharmaceutical industry because they're going to benefit by lower costs. They're going to benefit from the redundancy benefits that Christina spoke about. That's a good win, but it takes a while. If the drug is almost about to launch, phase 3, good data, or it's being, it's in the approval stage by the FDA, or it's on the market, boy, the pharmaceutical industry just tightens up. Even if you show them 50% lower cost, they may not do it because they don't want to change anything. They don't care about cost because it's 5% of the price, right? Remember that 95% margin? So you kind of got to hit them at the right point. So I think this is a cool opportunity, and hopefully that was educational. This is a target. It's a challenging target. It's a different approach than trying to disrupt an existing supply chain. But it's cool, and the pharmaceutical industry is increasingly seeing this. And inside the pharmaceutical companies, they're not as smart as you all on this topic. How do I create a biosynthetic pathway to a complex small molecule drug? The best answers typically reside in our companies.
We know something that the granddaddies don't.
Yeah.
All right. It's a little bit of hope. I wonder, so kind of thinking about, where to start on this problem. I mean, I wonder if each of you might offer, like, where do you see the low-hanging fruit? What are the sort of, maybe one obvious thing to go for, and then, I don't know, maybe later on we can get to, like, what would be the hoped for sort of future in 5 or 10 years? What would you like, where would we like to be? But I just wonder, like, where do we start with this? What's the sort of early goal we can shoot for, the things that we can begin doing to try to change the way we create these chemicals? Does anybody want to take that one?
I mean, I would just say that even in the past 2 days here, or in the past couple of years in this community, I think you're starting to see a lot of those ideas that aren't just theoretical anymore, that are really percolating into tangible products. I think it's, as we all know, this is a really thrilling moment for this community where it feels like we might have been shouting into the wind for a lot of years how powerful this could be, but it's finally, it feels real and tangible. And so I'm not a founder or anything, but I would say I would point to a lot of the companies that we've heard present, these two sitting next to me, and we clearly are starting now. And so for a short-term vision, I am more optimistic than I used to be. And I also just have always deeply admired this community because we ask these big questions and try to think about how do you profoundly change things. And it seems to me that it's really happening. There's more recognition. We've all heard about the executive order, G7, all of the funding. And I do think that might be enough to overcome that energy barrier of disrupting these rather sclerotic granddaddy systems.
Christina, where would you like to be in 5 years? Like, what would be the hoped for outcome?
IPO.
Yeah. Oh, yes. No, I mean, where would we like to be in 5 years? From Antheia's perspective, we would like to see our products, in the market and being used to produce some of the essential medicines, right, that are on these essential medicines lists from the World Health Organization, from the US FDA, and in particular ones that were on the shortage list. So to me, that would be a huge validation of the technology that we've worked, basically over the past 2 decades on, essentially starting, with my first graduate student at Caltech, right, who's now the CSO of Antheia when she first did this work. So it's just, to see that journey And then, we're getting to the stage now where we're actually producing, this year at commercial scales, and then in 5 years to begin to see the products now in the, being given to patients. I think that would just be hugely rewarding, right? And then beginning to have, look at these conversations, right? Again, as you say, Cameron, not just the US, not just the EU, but look at other regions, right? Where in particular these shortages are extremely prevalent, right? How can we begin to partner with local organizations, local entities, and make sure, right, it's not solving just part of the world's problem, but, the global community's issues with access to essential medicines.
Would you be open to taking a couple of questions from?
I think we should.
Does anybody have the woman behind Michael?
So what is a regulatory pathway to biosynthetically prepared drugs? Is there a GRAS equivalent for drugs as there is for ingredients, food ingredients?
Do you want me to? Yeah. So there's regulatory pathways, right? And it depends. Coming back to some of what we discussed here, it depends a bit on is it a large molecule, right? A biologic, an antibody, et cetera, or is it a small molecule? In the large molecule space, there's a particular regulatory pathway, and it gets into biosimilars, right? Which is something we hear as these drugs come off patent. Because it's basically, with large molecules, it's difficult / impossible to demonstrate equivalency. With small molecules, which is a lot of the generics that we're talking about here, you can demonstrate equivalency, meaning that you can demonstrate that what is being produced through a biomanufactured approach or through a fermentation approach is exactly the same as what you've extracted from the pig or extracted from the animal. So you don't have to necessarily go through the different stages of clinical trials. You demonstrate that your process is robust in producing it and that the output is consistent. You collect the data to demonstrate equivalency, which is standard for these regulatory agencies, and then you submit it for them to review and basically go through their approval process. So it's more streamlined.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the active ingredient has to be made under the GMP principles as well.
Yes.
And I think I saw Michael's hand next.
Okay, so we've got some historical examples to think about, right? So cannabinoids, they're getting lots of work now, and artemisinin. So what have we learned from those to inform sort of looking forward?
I'll jump in quick. So first, chemistry matters. Like I was gonna say, if I answered the previous couple of questions ago, what can we do now? It's a little indirect, Michael, but it kind of feeds into your question. The list of generic drugs is very easily market researched. And what those molecules look like is very easily researched. So put that chemistry hat on. What is the next drug shortage? Who knows, right? But there will be another drug category that's short, and let's get ahead of that. And so put your chemistry hat on. What can be developed in an economic viable pathway or with cell-free cascade, and make the investment and make the case that that's worthy of capital and time, so that we have the time to be ahead of the next shortage or to provide real supply chain solutions. How long is it taking you, Christina? 3 to 5 years from now. So that's what I would say. But on our medicine, it had a lot of government support, but it was also chemistry that was amenable to a pathway. So clearly there are small molecule drugs that are less amenable to a fermentation pathway. Probably aspirin is one of them. But there are others that great chemists like Christy in the back of the room and others that I don't know can say, yeah, we can get there. It's 4 or 5 complex steps or whatever, and I can ultimately get a meaningful titer so that the capital is reduced, and I can compete with the economics of the traditional chemistry route.
So we have time for one more. I think the gentleman. You, yeah.
Christina, you spoke to resilient supply chains and getting to a place where there's a lot more transparency about it. In my experience, most suppliers are not willing to disclose their tier 2, tier 3 supply and so on. So are there specific things that you have in mind or you can speak to that would create that ecosystem that you speak about where there is transparency throughout the supply chain?
I mean, that's a really great question, right? And I mean, I agree with you, right? There's just these organizations and institutions are not incentivized, right, to want to give that transparency. And so it's going to be difficult to change the system, right? I don't know if, I think it's going to be a large problem. I think there's going to have to be, honestly, governments coming together, not just the US, right? The US working with other governments as well, but governments coming together, really trying to develop different policies, legislation, and ways to incentivize and ways to really push the players, different players along the supply chain to be open up and be more transparent about this. But it's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen, and I think unless there's big, kind of push to get this to happen. I don't know, John or Cameron, I'm sure you guys also have your own perspectives on this.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that, in the best case scenario, the supply chain as we currently think of it is a lot shorter, and this problem doesn't disappear by any means, but is much more manageable if you're not talking about so many steps and so much coordination. If things are being made closer, are being made, in ways we're tracking better, maybe you cut the Gordian knot of having to understand and try and get data from so many different players in this space.
Yeah, I think they said it all. I think if there's a coordinated multinational governmental effort to force this transparency, and it was abundantly clear it was going to be thrust upon the generic companies, the industry will cooperate. They won't cooperate until they know they have to do it, and then they'll figure it out. The trade associations will get together and say, we got to deal with this, and they're brilliant people in the room, and they'll come up with a solution. But I think it needs that top-down pressure first, and then the industry will come forward with that. Without that, they won't come forward.
Well, let's meet back here in 5 years and
That's good.
see how it all turned out. Well, I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but please join me in thanking our great panel.